In the Orthodox world, there are authorities. The authorities are rabbis, institutions, organizations. But what I've seen in recent years is few trends. Sometimes they contradict each other. Sometimes they clash one another. And those clashes comes from bottom up. So things that are happening in the field, in synagogues, in schools, also in the street, which are not so much designed by rabbis, organizations, or, if I may say so, old monopolies. There are monopolies. There used to be monopolies, but the power of those monopolies are changing.
I'm Scott Kahn, and this is The Orthodox Conundrum. This is The Orthodox Conundrum on JewishCoffeehouse.com. I'm Scott Kahn. Religious Zionism means different things to different people. And ever since the days of Rav Avraham Yitzchak Cohen Kook, people have been arguing about what religious Zionism should represent. Rav Kook saw religious Zionism as a spiritual pursuit that was a precursor to the final redemption, though since he died in 1935, his ideas are in many ways theoretical, rather than a response to an actual Jewish state. Later, his son, Rav Tzvi Yehuda Kook, elaborated upon his father's ideology and applied many of those ideas to the state of Israel. The result was the religious Zionism that many of us are familiar with today, with a strong emphasis on settlements and a refusal to countenance the giving away of any land, particularly in Yehuda v'Shomron, also known as the West Bank. In contrast, there was another type of religious Zionism that was advocated by Rav Yitzchak Yaakov Reines, who founded the Mizrahi movement. Professor Aviezer Ravitsky, in his Messianism, Zionism, and Jewish Religious Radicalism, quotes an open letter that was published by a group of rabbis under Rabbi Reines' guidance. It reads, "Anyone who thinks the Zionist idea is somehow associated with future redemption and the coming of the Messiah, and who therefore regards it as undermining our holy faith, is clearly in error. Zionism has nothing whatsoever to do with the question of redemption. The entire point of this idea is merely the improvement of the condition of our wretched brethren. In recent years, our situation has deteriorated disastrously, and many of our brethren are scattered in every direction, to the seven seas, in places where the fear of assimilation is hardly remote. The Zionists saw that the only fitting place for our brethren to settle would be in the Holy Land. And if some preachers, while speaking of Zion, also mention redemption and the coming of the Messiah, and thus let the abominable thought enter people's minds that this idea encroaches upon the territory of true redemption, only they themselves are to blame, for it is their own wrong opinion they express." In a similar vein, and much more recently, Rabbi Norman Lamb wrote in 1995, "My feeling is that classical religious Zionism was tragically sidetracked after the euphoria of 1967 and linked to an extreme form of nationalism, i.e. territorialism, of which the elder Rav Kook would not have approved. I was disturbed by Gush Emunim from the very beginning. I admired them, and still do, but their ideology and self-certainty scared me. I should have talked up more. When I did talk and write about my messianic agnosticism, by which I meant that we can't, as mere humans, identify our exact location in the grand divine plan of redemption, that it may or may not be at Chalta de Gula, many of my colleagues and friends were dismayed, but I should not have been dissuaded. It is because I so identify with religious Zionism and am so proud of its brilliant record of achievement on behalf of the people and land and Torah of Israel, that I believe it is time to reassess the tendency to evaluate all current events through the messianic prism, without at all yielding a single iota of the belief in Biat HaMashiach B'chol Yom She'avo. For the latter phrase means, quite literally, whenever Messiah comes, and not necessarily that all that is happening this very day is related to his imminent arrival. The best way to have the Messiah come is by not talking about him overmuch, by not forcing his hand, as it were, by not transforming faith into hysteria, by not assuming that our impatience will influence him to come before the time that the Creator has set for him, but by proceeding with normal life, while entertaining the quiet but powerful hope that he comes soon." These two passages are representative of different but no less valid forms of religious Zionism. With that, I'd like to offer a summary of my own personal approach to religious Zionism. First, the Jewish people practically need and morally deserve their own state. Second, the only reasonable place for such a state is in the land of Israel, the historical homeland of the Jewish people. Third, the fact that we have actually, against all odds, built this state is unquestionably a gift from God. Fourth, part of that gift is that in an unquantifiable way, God's presence is more obvious, more apparent in the land of Israel. And to the degree that we don't experience that as a living reality, we must recognize that that's not God's fault, but our own. Fifth, it is extremely likely that the advent of the state of Israel represents the end of our current exile. Sixth, just because our exile is hopefully over, that doesn't mean that we know where we are on the long road to redemption. We pray that the state of Israel is the first flowering of our redemption, but there's no way to be certain that that's true. There have been times in our history, the aftermath of Hanukkah comes to mind, when we were not in exile, but we also had not reached the ultimate redemption. Hopefully this time is different, but we simply can't know. Seventh, in line with Rav Soloveitchik's ideology in his classic work, Kol Dodi Dofek, God's gifts to us demand a response. God does not want to speak in a monologue, but in a dialogue where we answer his generosity by using his gifts to us to make him present in the world. The major challenge for religious Zionism, then, is to decide, as best as we can, what that response should be. Does it mean settling every square kilometer of the land? Does it mean creating a medinah lemofet, an exemplary society in every way possible? Discovering what this challenge is and meeting it is our responsibility today. That challenge, in fact, is what informs today's podcast with Yair Ettinger. Yair is a well-known Israeli journalist who has real expertise in the questions and issues surrounding the religious Zionist world today. We delved into the interesting dichotomy that much of the religious Zionist community in Israel is simultaneously becoming more open and less reliant upon standard rabbinic authority in its religious practice, while simultaneously becoming more narrowly right-wing politically. We also talked about the national religious political parties today and whether they authentically represent the bulk of the religious Zionist population. We looked at the cracks that are appearing in some of the classic religious Zionist institutions and the apparent weakening of certain religious monopolies that exist. It was a very informative interview, and I hope that it provides some important insights into the future of religious Zionism in the State of Israel. Let me conclude my introduction by noting that I'm recording this as we enter Yom HaZikaron, Israel's Memorial Day for fallen soldiers and victims of terrorism. Yom HaZikaron is always a very difficult day, but there is an even greater sense of heaviness this year, which I'm sure will extend into Yom HaAtzmaut, Israel's Independence Day, which immediately follows it. In the past year, there have been so many victims of terror, so many fallen soldiers, numbers that we thought, naively, had been relegated to the past. This year, we are doubly reminded that their sacrifice was not just because we want a state of Israel, but because we absolutely need a state of Israel. At the Seder this year, I was concerned that it would be very emotional, given that I had gotten up from Shiva for my father only about 4 days earlier. As it turned out, we had a very beautiful and enjoyable Seder. There was only one time during the Seder that I was very emotional, along with my family. That's when we got to the paragraph beginning V'hi She'amda. Immediately before saying it, we recited the prayer that the chief rabbi of Israel, Rabbi Lau, had suggested that we say, asking God to release the hostages in Gaza. Then, singing V'hi She'amda, we looked at the words that said, Shelo echad bilvad, amad aleinu l'chalotenu, ela shebechol dor vador, omdim aleinu l'chalotenu, v'akadosh baruch hu matzilenu mi'adam. For it is not only one who got up against us to destroy us, but rather every generation they rise against us to destroy us. And the Holy One, blessed is He, saves us from their hand. This was the moment of true emotion, because we realized that the metaphysical laws of the universe are still in place. We know that nobody can remain indifferent to the Jewish people. And while there are many people who love and support us, we now see how many people also see Jews and Israel as the root of all evil. Now more than ever, we need to reaffirm that the sacrifice of those who died so that we can be here today was not in vain and will not be in vain. That we will defend the state of Israel and do everything we can to help it become the most moral and ethical country in the world. We'll get to my interview with Yair Ettinger in just a moment. First, let me remind you to subscribe to the Orthodox Conundrum podcast wherever you get your podcasts, and please rate it and write a review. Please subscribe to my Substack, Orthodox Conundrum Commentary. The link is in the description of this podcast, so get your free subscription today. And finally, remember that JCH Podcast Productions is the best place for you to go in order to produce your podcast from start to finish. Write to me at scott@jewishcoffeehouse.com so that we can discuss helping you make a high-quality, professional, and popular podcast. Yair Ettinger is a former Kogod Research Fellow at Shalom Hartman Institute of North America and an Israeli journalist whose work focuses primarily on religious affairs, the religious and Haredi communities, and their politics. Previously, he covered issues relating to Palestinian citizens of Israel and was a foreign affairs correspondent in Paris. Until 2017, he served as a journalist with Haaretz for 20 years. Yair studied Islam and Middle Eastern affairs at the Hebrew University in Jerusalem. His recent book, translated into English by Elon Levi and Mitch Ginsburg, is Frayed: The Disputes Unraveling Religious Zionists. In 2016, he was a visiting fellow at Brookings Institution in Washington. Yair is a graduate of Charles E. Smith Boys High School at Shalom Hartman Institute in Jerusalem, Hartman Advanced Beit Midrash, and the Shalom Hartman Institute Shiluv Yeshiva. Yair Ettinger, thank you very much for joining me today on the Orthodox Conundrum podcast.
Thank you very much for having me.
I'd like to open up with a big question because it seems to be the central question that you deal with in your book, Frayed, and that is the concept of what you call the privatization of religious Zionism. So this question alone could take us the entire time, but I want to open up by asking, what do you mean by that privatization?
Okay. Datim Leumim, Tzionut Datit, is an ideological group, community, stream in Judaism, and also an Orthodox one. And in the Orthodox world, there are authorities. The authorities are rabbis, institutions, organizations. That's how we know the Orthodox world, also in Israel in many ways. But what I've seen in recent years is few trends. Sometimes they contradict each other. Sometimes they clash one another. And those clashes comes from bottom up. So things that are happening in the field, in synagogues, in schools, also in the street, which are not so much designed by rabbis, organizations, or, if I may say so, old monopolies. There are monopolies. There used to be monopolies, but the power of those monopolies are changing. For instance, if I may just give a short one, Yeshivat Merkaz Harav, Yeshivat of the Datim Leumim. Every Yom Yerushalayim, soon, in the end of Iyar, we're going to have Yom Yerushalayim. So the main event of the Tzionut Datit is taking place there. This is the place where, this is the laboratory, this is the leadership. This laboratory designed Tzionut Datit in many, many ways. If you're looking at Gush Emunim, if you're looking at religious perceptions, if you're looking at halachic point of views of many, many questions. So the place is still Merkaz Harav officially, but there are other yeshivot, other places which are affecting and designing and moving the different groups within Tzionut Datit to different places. So the status of this monopoly is not as it used to be. And today there are many actors in the field.
Okay, there's a lot to talk about there. I'd like to ask about some of these fault lines, some of these places where the old monopolies are breaking up. Can you give some examples? You're speaking specifically here about a yeshiva, but what about concepts? What about ideas that might be changing? Like, what are these fault lines that are dividing? I know, for example, you speak a lot about feminism. So can you give some examples of some of those ideas, some of those religious ideas that are creating those fault lines from the bottom up?
Okay, so if I would speak to someone from really the outside, from America, I would say, look at the gay parade in Jerusalem. For many years, this parade is taking place in Jerusalem. It's really different than other parades in elsewhere in Israel and outside of Israel. But in Jerusalem, you'll have every year, you'll have people marching at the march, at the parade, which are Datim Leumim. They wear kippah. They grew up in those institutions of Tzionut Datit, Bnei Akiva, maybe even Merkaz Harav or different groups near Merkaz Harav. But on the other hand, you will have demonstrators, people who are protesting against the parade, and they are also Tzionut Datit. So these protesters, of course, they are more from the more conservative small c side or branch of Tzionut Datit, but both of them are Tzionut Datit. Another example would be the politics. There used to be Hamafdal, the party, the Religious Zionist party, which was the official one and had connections with also Merkaz Harav, also Bnei Akiva, the youth movement of the Datim Leumim, and there used to be one party. You also had someone who wears kippah, who is observant maybe in the Likud or even in the Labor Party. But today, this is a lot. This is different. You have, I think, 7 different political parties with Datiyim Leumim, someone who wears kippah, observant, keeps Tariag mitzvot, and he also says to the public, I am your authentic representative as Dati Leumi. So these are just 2 short examples, but different trends and different expressions of being Datiyim Leumim.
I'm going to come back to the politics soon because that's a very big issue, which I don't want to skip. But before we get there, I first want to ask you, Yair, to what do you attribute the fact that these monopolies are breaking from the bottom up now? Israel's been around for 75 years, and now is the time that it's breaking up. What has changed?
So, a few things. First of all, I think maybe the monopolies were not as strong as we used to think about them. This is something that I have to say. Maybe it was always like that, but it was more quiet under the radar. It wasn't so hectic as today. But also there were few crises that I can point. The first one, maybe the biggest one, was 2005, the disengagement, hitnatkut. This was a really major moment because this was a trauma for many Datiyim Leumim. I'm talking about of course, the evacuation of the settlements in the Gaza Strip. This is very much in the news right now, but this was, I would say, trauma for the majority of the Datiyim Leumim, but only for them. In the dispute or tension between Datiyim Leumim, the Dati Leumi tribe, and maybe the secular tribe, this was a trauma. Let's put this aside. But it was also inside. There was a trauma because the authority of the rabbis, the leaders of this community, political leaders, rabbis, spiritual leaders who were leading that, I would say, struggle against the disengagement, because most of the Datiyim Leumim were against it. So I think something has broken in that moment where Rabbanim, where really senior Rabbanim said, this is something that's not going to happen. And there is a crack. There is something that happens. It's not only directly towards those leaders, but whenever there is a crack, something goes through that crack. Maybe sometimes it's not really directly because of the disengagement, but it was a really big shock that took place. Other things that I can say that affected this moment was also internet, for instance, or Facebook. That people who felt neglected or not seen as women in synagogues, they could share their experience with other women elsewhere, or LGBT, or women in the army, or so this underground feeling that used to be underground, it came up on the surface and affected, I think, the way that many people see themselves and other people in the same community.
There's a lot there to talk about. I want to ask about that hitnatkut, the disengagement from Gaza, and the fact that many rabbis who at the time said this will not happen, theologically, religiously, we don't believe it's possible for there to be a withdrawal because the move toward Yemot HaMashiach, the days of redemption, is inexorably moving forward. So that removed, I think you're saying, some of their perhaps prophetic authority, so to speak. The fact that they have Ruach HaKodesh, that they have this Holy Spirit, people may have doubted that some more. What I find fascinating, and this is what I want to ask you now, is that as a result of that, you're suggesting, and the evidence shows it may very well be true, that all these fault lines that had been submerged came up. There was less reliance on the rabbis. But that was actually a political thing that happened. And in the political realm, Tzionut Hadatit, religious Zionism, is as right-wing as it's ever been. In fact, it has right now, between the 2 or 3 right-wing parties that represent that society, it has 14 seats, which is very big historically compared to what it was in the past. It has sometimes been about that big, but usually smaller in the days of the National Religious Party, the Mafdal. Mm-hmm. So it's interesting that politically, which is the area you think that their authority would have been most damaged, it's actually stronger, at least on a political level, than ever before. How do you explain that?
Okay, so let's talk about Ben Gvir, because I think Ben Gvir is really a new thing that entered the mainstream Datiyim Leumiyim because of many political reasons, but also I would say it's the same crap. People friction in Tzionut Datit, because for many years, for instance, Meir Kahana, maybe people know Meir Kahana. Meir Kahana, he didn't see himself as Tzionut Datit at all, and he thought he was closer to people who are voting Likud. He was competing with the Likud on these votes, but Meir Kahana and his ideology, which was always outside the fence, it was illegitimate in Tzionut Datit. I think he entered this area or this field of Tzionut Datit under the name Tzionut Datit with Bezalel Smotrich, and I'm talking about his students, his pupils, Ben Gvir and Amichai Eliyahu. They entered that field because the authority was not as strong as it was before. There was no one to say, hey, stop. And what I think is that we see the Tzionut Datit going to the right in many ways, but you also see other forces or other elements which are from, I would say, the left. And generally speaking, I think that, Tzionut Datit in general, they always held 3 flags: Torat Israel, Am Israel, Eretz Israel. And back in the 80s, when I was younger, and I remember that there was a debate about the question of the Judah and Samaria and Gaza. If you're looking at Rav Amital Meimad, they were challenging Gush Emunim. They're saying, okay, the state or the land is holy, but we can compromise. But what I think is that this dispute, this discussion is in many ways over, because Tzionut Datit and Eretz Israel and the agenda of going with the settlements, in many ways, it won. And by the way, not only in Tzionut Datit, all the political map moved towards this normalization of, let's say, lines of 67. But what happened at the same time that, if I'm talking about the question of Eretz Israel, is really, I would say, in some way, in a consensus, other questions came to the table, and those questions are, I would say, more civil, about civil life, about halacha, about women's rights, about conservative orthodoxy and more liberal orthodoxy. And it's a lot of fragments.
I understand, and you expressed that very well. I want to stay on that point for a little longer, because one of the things you talk about in your book is the premiership of Naftali Bennett, who was the head of the Jewish Home Party, which was built on the rump of the old Mafdal, the National Religious Party. And yet it was, I'm not saying his being prime minister was a failure, but it only lasted a year. Jewish Home by Yehudi is now gone. It doesn't exist anymore for all intents and purposes. It's certainly not in the Knesset, which means really Mafdal is not there anymore. Instead, you have Bezalel Smotrich in Tzionut Hadatit, you have Noam, you have Ben Gvir and Otzma Yehudit. These are not just right-wing parties politically. They also represent a right-wing religious understanding.
Right.
These are people who are very much, generally I should speak, in the Har Hamor, Merkaz Harav world, rather than in the, let's say, Gush Etzion type of world. They are not part of that. Right. So why is it that on the political map, if politically, when it comes to the settlements, we've moved exclusively to the right, but in civil things, we've moved all over the place, and yet those politicians still, even religiously, only represent that right-wing strain?
Right. So I think this is really interesting, and we have to look at the next elections and the ones after. Because what happened with Naftali Bennett was a political drama. Naftali Bennett, we could also speak about essence, about the ideology of Naftali Bennett, that thought that he is going to to take Israel to a different place, to create new or old alliance with Chilonim, with center left, and he will take the Israeli politics there. But I think that his actions, his political actions, made people from Tzionut Datit, mainly from Tzionut Datit, so furious, and his actions were considered as betrayal because he took their votes and left all part of Tzionut Datit outside, Haredim outside, and Likud outside. And he said, "Okay, my tribe, my aim, I'm aiming at this secular center left tribe, and these are like a Zionist alliance, old alliance, Israeli one. But there is also the Jewish one, and he neglected this one. And I think many people do not forgive him. What I'm trying to say is that Naftali Bennett was playing political cards, and he was punished. I think maybe he will be punished as well in the future because many of the Datim Leumim can't forgive him for these actions that he made, he took. But I think that the next election will show us that also many people from Tzionut Datit, from mainstream Tzionut Datit, find it hard to forgive Bezalel Smotrich and also Ben Gvir and also Rotman because of the judicial reform, judicial coup, whatever you like to call it. That's why people are saying, okay, let's stop. This is not balanced because Naftali Bennett maybe took one step to the left and this one to the right. Maybe we should try to find a new center, a new Dati Leumi center that we can vote for. As I say, there are 7 different parties with Datim Leumim, so they can choose right now.
At the same time, there no longer exists a centrist or leftist Dati Leumi party like Meimad and Rabbi Melchior, right, who back in the 80s and 90s was Rav Amital's party, that did represent a labor Zionist type vision. And what's interesting also is that historically, if we go back, the Mafdal until 1973 was in some ways a kind of leftist party. Right. It represented the vision of Rav Reines and people like Rav Soloveitchik, who were very much in line with the old labor ideals rather than what became the Menachem Begin Likud ideals, and things have switched completely. Is there actually any hope of some sort of centrist party arising now that does represent the religious Zionist world that is not necessarily in the camp of Smotrich and Ben Gvir?
No doubt. I think this is something that many people, I don't know, I see a few actors are, warming up because they think they can rebuild Mafdal. So I have good news for them and bad news for them. One of them is that many people are going to vote to some Mafdal like that. They would like that. Something that would be right-wing and orthodox, but still Israeli and mamlachti. Ben Gvir is not mamlachti. I don't know how you translate mamlachti, but something that is, going with the state, with the importance of value of being statehood. That's how you say it? I don't know.
Yeah, I think you're probably referring to a type of consensus rather than being an extremist party.
Consensus. I accept that. So that's the good news. I think maybe Matan Kahana, he has, I don't know if that's his dream, but some people would like Matan Kahana or he was partnered with Bennett to create something like that. Or maybe someone new. There are a few names, but I think that the one that we will rebuild, the Mafdal, will discover that in 2024, 25, 26, it's not the same because the political map, it's really hard to bring back the horses. Many people would see their identity, their political, religious identity in different ways. And maybe this is okay. This is something that it's natural for such a big and influencing community to be so diverse as today. So maybe he will get some votes, but it won't be the old Mafdal. It won't be the Mafdal of Naftali Bennett. You remember the first time Naftali Bennett ran to the Knesset, he got 12 seats in the Knesset. That was amazing because he took a party of 3 seats and created a huge one with 12 seats. So I don't think this is going to happen. not very easily. This is it's a different time.
It sounds like you're saying, and please correct me if I'm wrong, that some of the people who would never vote for Ben Gvir or Smotrich or Noam, at the same time, they may say at this point, and perhaps I'm someone who falls into that category, to say, why do I need to vote for a Mafdal? I'm perfectly happy voting for Benny Gantz or Likud or Yair Lapid, somebody else, because unlike in the past, there are religious representatives in those parties, and why do I need to vote for a religious party at all? Perhaps that's what people are thinking.
Okay, this is correct. But still, I think if you're looking at mainstream Datim Leumim, many people still looking for the sector, something that will be you can mark it as Dati Leumi with the Kippa Sruga, because Datim Leumim, and this is quite funny, I would say, Datim Leumim are very much influencing. They're everywhere in politics, culture, academia, business, wherever. But still, in many ways, they see themselves as minority, as an ideology that have to fight for itself, to say, hey, we have identity. This is not something that will go easily with other partners. Look at this. Naftali Bennett, when he came to politics, 2012, he brought with him his friend, his partner, Ayelet Shaked. She's not Dati Leumi. He said, okay, I am post migzari. I'm post sector. I can build a partnership with someone from the outside. Whereas Smotrich, and for sure Noam, and also Ben Gvir, he said, okay, my alliance is elsewhere. Ben Gvir is people from the periphery, from maybe Likud voters. More traditional, not so much Orthodox necessarily, but also Haredim. Their partnership is with Haredim. So what I'm saying is that still many Datim Leumi, mainstream, people who are outside, they're not in the Dati Leumi ghetto, if I may say so. They're still looking. Many people still looking for the sectorial frame. They want this identity still strong.
So let me ask you about what you said in terms of Ayelet Shaked's post-Migzar, post-sectarian type of Israel, because I believe you mentioned in your book that right now the Dati Leumi population is 22% of Israel, however that's defined. That's actually a huge percentage. That's close to a quarter of the entire country. And at the same time, obviously, 14 seats for Dati Leumi parties is not nearly that amount. It's about half of 22%. First of all, my question is, where are they? Who are they voting for? What are they doing until that unifying party comes into play? Where are they? And number two, that number 22%, is that really an accurate number? What I mean is that there's a huge group, I believe, though I don't have numbers to prove it, of people who are neither Chiloni nor Dati. They're somewhere in the middle. We can call them Masorati, traditional on some level. Maybe they're people who are no longer religious, but they still keep Shabbat. Or, for example, they may eat kosher only, even though they don't put on tefillin in the morning. I don't know how it's defined, but they're not Chilonim in the classic sense. So my questions are, where are the rest of the Dati Leumi community? And how large is this group that potentially is out there beyond the classic Orthodox people?
Okay, so the 22% is a number brought by Israel Democracy Institute. They made a huge research, and it's quite old. It's about 9 years old. But the thing is that I don't think there was such a big research in the Israeli society since. What they said was that the Datiim Leumim, they have the margins, the fringes are really wide. Because if you look at classic, as core Datim Leumim, people who grew up in the Mossadot Datim Leumim, the schools, yeshivot, ulpenot, these are about 12, 13% of the Jewish population in Israel. But if you ask people, Israelis, do you identify with Datim Leumim? This is different. You don't have to be Dati Leumi in order to identify with them. And then you find that people are secular, but they identify with the Datim Leumim. They could be Haredim, and they identify with the Datim Leumim. They could be, of course, traditional. This is really big group in Israel. So what I'm saying is that people like this. The popularity of this ideology, of this community, is quite high in Israel. And that's why I think Naftali Bennett got those votes back in 2013. That was because he brought those people who could vote to Likud few years before or a few years later, vote to Likud, to Lieberman, to other parties. And he said, okay, we can be like a big umbrella that is Dati Leumi, and people will identify with us. The thing is, that's I hope that answers your question, because these are people who are shifting. They could be in other places around the right-wing Israeli politics, but not necessarily Datim Leumim in their everyday life. And I think Naftali Bennett lost most of them. I mean, he gained those votes and lost it.
He lost them even when he was prime minister.
Right.
Was prime minister with almost no seats.
Right.
I want to ask about Bezalel Smotrich and Itamar Ben-Gvir, and something which I don't understand. I'm switching gears a little bit over here. But before the last elections, and the reason I'm asking this, I'll interject, is because I think it might say something about their understanding of leadership. Before the last elections, I remember that the Religious Zionist Party got up there and they insisted that only Bibi Netanyahu can be the leader of Likud. That's a very strange thing for somebody in a different party to say about the member of a different party. In other words, they weren't saying that Bezalel Smotrich has to be the head of Tzionut Hadatit. That was obviously there. They were saying that we will only join a coalition with Likud if Bibi is in charge of Likud. This seems to me to be representative on some level of the populist nationalism that's in some ways spreading across the world in many different places. Perhaps Donald Trump is a similar example of that, this type of populist nationalism. I want to understand why someone like Smotrich said that, what they're thinking, and what it says about how they understand what leadership is.
Okay, so I think that in many ways, we were talking earlier about alliance. Who is your partner? Who is your natural brother? I think old Tzionut Datit, in many ways, even Rav Kook, he thought that his alliance is the Chalutzim, the secular, the Dor HaMiyasdim, those who formed or built this country. But something has changed, and this is also, I think, it has related to the disengagement. But never mind. I think that few trends, few reasons or forces brought part of Tzionut Datit, and this is the part of Rotman and Smotrich, and also Ben-Gvir, of course, to see themselves in a confrontation with the secular left. They see themselves in this is the dispute, and this is in many ways a historical dispute that we have to take over, because this is the old elite, and we have to change it. We have to take over. And that's why I think that, in the Israeli map, in the political map, it's so diverse and it's so extreme right now. And the question of Netanyahu was a big, big question that brought these two tribes against one another. The people who don't like Bibi, Rak Lo Bibi, and people who are Rak Bibi, just Bibi. And Bibi Netanyahu, and I think this is also a political move, that he brought his umbrella, his group is so tight together. Haredim, let's talk about Haredim. In the past, Haredim could go with the left, but no longer. And also, besides Smotrich, he said that if the question of Netanyahu is dividing the state of Israel, the Israeli society, so there is no doubt that he's going to take side with Netanyahu and not with people who want to throw him away, which is the left. And this is really, I think it's deep. It's not only political. It's deep. I think this is something that changed in people who see themselves as pupils or people who go follow the way of Rav Kook. Because really Rav Kook, and they follow Rav Kook, but I think really Rav Kook really saw himself as partner, as he admired Chalutzim, and this is changing right now. We can also talk about dryness. I think this is also, you mentioned dryness, and those two attitudes inside Tzionut Datit. In many ways, you ask me what's new in Tzionut Datit. Maybe it's old. This is also something that it's old, because Rav Reines, he was more pragmatic. He said we can be partners. We can go, even though we are Orthodox, we can be still Zionists. We can be still go with the Zionist project. And of course, Rav Kook was more revolutionary and also romantic about it. He said, we can change it, we can redesign it. But still, he saw the Chilonim, secular, as his partner. And I think his followers are changing.
That's a very interesting insight. Let me go down and ask you about Itamar Ben-Gvir again. I know we've gone back and forth with him. According to current polls, it sounds like that if the election were held today, and I realize Israeli polls are notoriously incorrect and inaccurate. Nevertheless, polls right now show a complete flip of the balance between Itamar Ben-Gvir and Bezalel Smotrich, whereas before there were more supporters of Tzniut Hadatit and fewer of Ben-Gvir's Otzma. Now it sounds like, at least according to the most recent poll that I saw, if the election were held today, Itamar Ben-Gvir and Otzma Yehudit alone would get 10 seats, whereas Bezalel Smotrich would barely cross the threshold with about 4 seats, as I saw it. What do you attribute his increasing popularity right now? I assume it has everything to do with October 7th, but my second half of the question is, he was police minister. The police obviously failed on October 7th. Why has he not had some of the guilt that people attached to Bibi also attached to Itamar Ben-Gvir for also failing in his job?
Right. So, no doubt, I think if you look rationally, it's really no doubt in my eyes, no doubt that Ben-Gvir didn't deliver. He promised security. He promised that everything is going to be meshilut, to hold this the wheel really strong, and I'm going to rule. And for sure, he did not deliver. He failed. He failed because people are, even before October 7th, people are...
It was the deadliest year in many years.
Yeah. So, but I think this is quite clear that Ben-Gvir, and this is not Tzniut Datit question. Ben-Gvir, he gains because he gains votes and popularity because he's the most right-wing. There is nothing right to him. And that is why that whatever happens, for many people who are frustrated from Netanyahu not being enough hardline, enough winning the war, enough right-wing, so Ben-Gvir would be the only answer because he's the only one. So, and I think those votes or this popularity that he gets, it's not so much, or not especially from Tzniut Datit. This is from Haredim. This is from Israelis, from all over the place, mainly peripheria. We saw that in the last elections. His popularity is huge in many places in Israel, and not in Tzniut Datit especially. But of course, in Smotrich, it's different. Smotrich, people see him as someone who took the vote or took the mandate of Tzniut Datit. He took the name Tzniut Datit. He renamed his Tkuma Ichud Leumi party as Tzniut Datit. He took the brand name of Tzniut Datit and said, I am the representative. I am going to be all the spectrum of Tzniut Datit. And this is clear. No, you can't sell that notion or that saying to anyone because this is not true. People knows that he represents only the Haredali side, only the hardliner, the more conservative side religiously and also politically in Tzniut Datit. So that's what happened. That's the balance that is going towards Ben-Gvir and not Smotrich.
I think, and I'm curious if you agree with me, that it's almost a bug in the system in the Israeli political mind that, and maybe perhaps this is true everywhere, I don't want to just speak about Israelis, but at least here, it seems to me that a lot of people, quote unquote, fall for tough talk. In other words, Bibi is a master at this. Prime Minister Netanyahu, in many ways, is very pragmatic when it comes to actual policy, but he talks tough, and people believe his talk more than they believe his actual actions. In the same way, Ben-Gvir was a massive failure, even before October 7th. Israel was not safe, and yet, because he talks tough, people, they buy it. And I find this to be extraordinarily frustrating. When I just listen, I say, I know, but he doesn't follow through. I care more about walking the walk than talking the talk, and it seems to be almost a bug in the system because this happens over and over again.
Absolutely. I think it's happening also in America, right? And this has a lot to do with social network. It has a lot to do with Twitter, X. This is because when you talk the talk, you're considered to be brave, serious. Look at Ben-Gvir. He's writing, Hamas loves Biden. And at the same moment, people, are freaking out. This is really something that people from the right saying, this is something we wanted to hear. And people from the left are saying, oh my God, this is a disaster. And the whole dynamic of politics is taking place in Twitter more than in actual life. And this is something really amazing for political scientists that is really affecting the Israeli politics. And that is why Ben-Gvir cracked, he knows this DNA. And that's why he is so popular.
Let's talk about the policies that people like Ben-Gvir actually advocate, as well as Bezalel Smotrich. Obviously, Ben-Gvir is even more rightward, but they both are relatively extremist. Ben-Gvir has brought into the Israeli bloodstream policies that had been considered completely anathema, outside the pale, only a few years ago. Ben-Gvir believes in transfer of some sort. Whether he says that out loud anymore is a different question, but he essentially is a student of the Kahanist school, which had been banned from Israeli politics, both practically and also philosophically. People didn't want anything to do with Meir Kahana. How is it that has re-entered into the Israeli bloodstream? I realize it's partially because of what's happened over the past year, but also in practice, do they actually believe the things that they say? Do they actually believe if they get power, they can transfer people out and Israel will still survive? Because it seems to me, as someone who's speaking purely pragmatically, that would be, forget the moral issues involved, that would be a horrendous disaster. Israel would become the new South Africa in the 1980s. It would essentially be a state that would be a pariah state and it would effectively cease to exist eventually. Do they not see that?
Well, I think the normalization of Ben-Gvir is really fascinating question. It has a lot to do with the fact that Israel as a whole moved to the right in many ways, but I think the most important thing about Ben-Gvir was Netanyahu. Netanyahu, he really designed the political, ideological map of Israel. When Netanyahu, somewhere in 2015, Ben-Gvir is something from 2021, I think this is the first time that Netanyahu brought him inside. But when Netanyahu formed his coalition, and as a strategic coalition that goes bind together in sickness and in health and in Ba'esh u'Bamayim, in every condition, this was, and the polarization of the Israeli politics, this was the moment that he ensured that he can do everything. And when Netanyahu brought inside Ben-Gvir, I think this was a crucial moment. And the message to many Israelis that even though Meir Kahana was not legitimate by Likud back in the 80s, Likud, when Meir Kahana stood up and spoke in the Knesset, people from Likud and for sure from the Mafdal moved out. They didn't want to hear that. They said, this is not legitimate. And when Netanyahu, which is leadership, popularity is higher at least as Menachem Begin, when he said that Ben-Gvir is kosher, no problem with Ben-Gvir, I think this was the crucial moment. This really affected the minds of many, many Israelis.
Wow. I understand that, and I find it very, very troubling because of many moral as well as pragmatic reasons. I want to move on to Matan Kahana. You mentioned him before. Matan Kahana was the religious affairs minister when Bennett was the prime minister, and even though he himself belongs certainly to the religious Zionist community, he was open to making many widespread changes and actually did some serious changes to the system, decentralizing much of the religious establishment. I want to ask about the Haredi response to that, because you wrote that it's not just about power, but about the right to define Judaism that caused them to be so against what happened over there. What do you mean by that? Why were the Haredim so upset by religious reforms that don't actually affect the Haredim, because they're going to still go to their own Batei Din?
Right. So this is another big monopoly that we're talking about. In my book and in general, I think the huge monopoly of chief rabbinate. Because chief rabbinate for many Tzionim Datim, this was the most important institution. For Rav Kook, he was the first chief rabbi, and he said this is not only a governmental symbol, it's also, it has theology value in that institution. And this institution sank. This institution, its power, its popularity, its the way that people look at chief rabbinate from all sides of the map. You mentioned Haredim. Haredim never saw themselves as they're not obeying chief rabbinate because they have their own rabbis, right? And Chilonim, they were frustrated more and more because of chief rabbinate extreme actions, and they said we were going to get married in Cyprus because we don't want this monopoly to rule our life. But the only ones who were still loyal to these institution were the Dim Leumim, and this had changed. Matan Kahana, I think he's representing this change, that he said, you know what, this institution, it doesn't have to be so strong. It's monopoly. We can change it a little bit. We can bring other organizations that gives kashrut, and not only not only chief rabbinate. We can bring in people who say is batei din for conversion, the giyur, and all these kinds of. And he wasn't the first one, by the way. He was, I think, responding to something that happened down, as I said, bottom up. People who were activists, who were still Orthodox, 100% observant, Datiyim Leumiyim, Zionist and Orthodox, and said, you know what? We can find other answers. We can find other institutions or private organizations that can take the chief rabbinate place. So you were asking about Haredim. Haredim, that the deal with Haredim is different. They never saw chief rabbinate as so important. It wasn't so important for their daily life, for their community life, for what's kasher, what's giyur, whatever. But they said, we would like to control Judaism in the state of Israel. Judaism not for us, for you. Judaism for non-Haredim. And this was really important. It was important for Haredim always. And this, it's a little bit, you could say, Hippocratic, because you don't eat that kosher food that you give certificate to. But that's the deal with Haredim. And when Matan Kahana said, you know what, I'm going to design Jewish, let's say, policy differently, so this was fire. And that's why Matan Kahana is really red flag for many Haredim. Even today, they can't forgive them. He's a symbol of Orthodox, but rival.
Before we conclude, I want to ask you a few questions about the future of religious Zionism in Israel. And the first question on that score that I'd like to ask you is comparing religious Zionism, the world of Dati Leumi, to what is called modern or centrist orthodoxy in places like the United States or the UK. I have spoken to people about that before in this podcast, and I'd like Yair to hear your take on it. What are the primary distinguishing marks that distinguish modern orthodoxy from religious Zionism per se?
Okay, so first of all, it's really interesting because your first question was what's happening now. I think this is also very important because the world is shrinking and people are talking to one another. People are making aliyah from United States. They affect the Jewish life here also. You see new things here, and people are traveling. People are going to different shul. They see different trends, and they take from one another. So I think many, many things American modern Orthodoxy took from Israel, and also Israeli community, Dati Leumi, also took from America, such as, feminism, LGBT questions and stuff like that. So I think a lot of questions. This is actually, it's not a question of the community, it's the question of orthodoxy. The challenges of orthodoxy, the question of orthodoxy in the 21st century are the same questions here and there. Both sides are also reacting to changes in Western world. Okay, this is first of all. But I think that unlike many people think that the American model is more liberal, more to the left, and sometimes it's true, but sometimes it's the opposite. I think that if I'm looking at privatization, if I'm looking at the mechanism of making halakha, of answering halachot here in Israel, and in America, I think there is still a difference. Because here, also because of the rabbinate, because many people, Datim Leumim, see themselves as alternative identity. Their identity is not rabbinate. They're saying, I'm a freelance. I'm not with you. I'm not with the institution. So I am creating something new. I'm creating a new shul. I'm creating. It's really easy in Israel to create a new shul. It's really easy. You just take, the school, the one class in school, or something, and you create a new shul and new maybe a new character, new tiny identity. It could be to the right, to the left, whatever. In America, I think still the organizations, the Orthodox organizations are really strong. The OU, Young Israel are still very much, people are not so much challenging or battling, maybe challenging, but not confronting those institutions so easily. So maybe the intuition is saying, the opposite way. No, but I think in Israel, many people from the liberal side would say, the liberal Orthodox side would say, I don't need the institution. I can just gather with 50 people and create a new shul or new school.
Then let me ask you about the future. Do you think that those institutions will get weaker over time, or will there be a backlash, thereby strengthening them? For example, let's use the chief rabbinate as one case. Do you think that push to do things outside of the chief rabbinate means that the chief rabbinate monopoly, as Matan Kahana tried to do, is going to be weakened over time, or do you think that that's an idle dream?
So I think that chief rabbinate, for instance, it could be stronger. It could be bigger. It could have more jobs for people, for more rabbis, more functions, more power, more money, more whatever. But its popularity, it's not going higher. It's going lower. And this is, you can see it in polls, that it's one of the less popular institutions in Israel right now, and I don't see it changing at all. In many ways, chief rabbinate is still an asset, a political asset, but it's not. It has nothing to do with Jewish identity in Israel. That's why this institution, I'm quite skeptic about it. And as I said about Mafdal, new Mafdal, it's a real big question. Someone could try to form a new Dati Leumi party, and it will have some future. That's what I'm saying. But it won't have the same future as it has in the past, as monopoly, as like the only go-to party. This is changing, and the bigger picture is that this community is very diverse. It wants different things. It has different perceptions of orthodoxy and religiousness and Israeliness, and that is, I think, you can't change it.
And I think the chief rabbinate itself is doing its best efforts in order to make people feel that even more so. When somebody like Chief Rabbi Yosef takes a party line that is exclusively Haredi and essentially, I'm sorry to say it, but denigrates the contributions of the vast majority of Israeli society who serve in the army, saying they had nothing to do with it. Essentially, it was all the people in yeshivas, which is more or less, I'm simplifying, that's more or less what he said. It's very difficult for the vast majority of people, even in the Dati Leumi, religious Zionist world, to take that institution seriously when it so obviously doesn't represent their beliefs.
Absolutely. I think this is really, it symbolized the place of chief rabbinate. Many people, I think this was also a point where also many people from Tzniut Datit were loyal to chief rabbinate. They felt that we had enough. We can't take it anymore. And you saw, we're talking about the war, where we didn't talk about how so many people from Tzniut Datit are fighting this war, and sadly we're losing them. But the reaction to what Rav Yitzchak Yosef said came from parents who lost their child, Datim Leumim, and said, this is enough, this is unacceptable, and you have to apologize, you, the chief rabbi, that maybe in the past we thought you have some kind of theological value. You have to apologize, you're just a political figure.
Right, absolutely. Okay, yeah, I have two more questions. You mentioned October 7th and what's happened since then. What are some of the biggest changes that have taken place in the Dati Leumi community since October 7th over the past 7 months?
Wow, so that's a huge question, but I think to focus on the question of what happened here in 2023 regarding the judicial reform. I think the question of who is our allies, who are our allies, how do we see, are they Haredim or secular, Chilonim? And I think there is a shift here. Because Bezalel Smotrich said to this community, our natural brothers and sisters are Haredim. We are with the Haredim, and we're not taking the part because of all what we were talking about, all what happened in the last decade in Israel. So we're taking the side of Haredim. And here, what happened was in the mainstream Datiim Leumim, something has changed in that war. I think people recalled this ethos, this common ethos of Israeli Zionist culture, sense, feeling that we can be rivals politically, but we're still brothers because we're fighting the same war and we are at the same unit or the same tank. And this is something that it's really interesting because you see that now one of the most boiling questions is the question of the draft law for Haredim. The fact that Haredim are not going to the army in that time that so many people are losing their life, their sons, their loved ones. So many people from Tzionut Datit that were in the past, maybe they didn't care, they were indifferent about this question. Now they're saying that's enough. We can't take it anymore. So that's a huge question, but maybe this is just one point that I think this is changing.
Yeah, and I would say that the way that I've often phrased that is people in the Dati Leumi world are sick and tired of hearing, you fight and we learn, you're welcome. We're tired of hearing that.
This deal is over for many Dati Leumi, yeah.
Okay, my final question here is asking about the biggest challenges over the next 10 or 15 years for the religious Zionist world. What are the main things that people in that world are going to have to grapple with?
Wow. I think there are a few questions, of course, but this question of who are we? What are we? Many people see themselves as sector. We are a group. We are a minority, but this minority is no longer smaller minority. This is elite. And the question if the Tzionut Datit can take its role, and there is no one Tzionut Datit, there are a few Tzionut Datit, but how people from Tzionut Datit will see other partners. What will be their partners? Can we be in power? Can we be the same elite that we always wanted to be as a bridge? Are we still a bridge? Or are we the problem? Are we the answer? Are we the problem? This is one question. And of course, halachic questions. So many different halachic questions. For decades, I think questions of women in Jewish life. It's a huge question. It's not new. It's maybe 40 years. It's challenging rabbis, challenging halacha, and this would for sure, because in Tzionut Datit people are asking those questions, and I'm curious to see what new answers would be, and it will be interesting for sure.
It'll definitely be interesting. How long will it take to get there and what there is, I guess we'll find out, but it should be an interesting ride along the way. Yair Ettinger, I thank you very much for joining me today.
Thank you so much.
Subscribe to The Orthodox Conundrum on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, or anywhere else you get your podcasts. Please visit jewishcoffeehouse.com for other episodes of The Orthodox Conundrum, as well as many other great podcasts, including Intimate Judaism, The Maimonides Minute, Chochmat Nashim, The Francisca Show, and Let My People Eat. I'd appreciate it if you go to Apple Podcasts and rate and review The Orthodox Conundrum. It takes literally 2 minutes. It's just giving a certain number of stars and writing 1 or 2 sentences. Please like the Orthodox Conundrum podcast on Facebook and join our growing Facebook group, the Orthodox Conundrum Discussion Group, where you can feel free to discuss issues in Orthodoxy in an honest and friendly environment. I hope you'll become a Jewish Coffee House patron on Patreon. Just click on the link in the description of this podcast, and you can get bonus episodes, Jewish Coffee House merch, and more. You'll get special episodes on all sorts of topics that are only available to subscribers, and you'll be helping Jewish Coffee House spread our message of a welcoming, intellectually engaged, and honest Orthodoxy. Just join Patreon. It's only a couple of dollars a month, and you can stop anytime, so join today. Finally, do you have a message that needs to get out? Do you want to promote your business, your organization, or your cause? The best way is by producing a podcast, and Jewish Coffee House can make it happen. I have experience producing hundreds of podcasts, both for myself and for satisfied clients. Whether you want to learn everything you need in one day, or relax and record and let me do the heavy lifting, Jewish Coffee House Productions will work with you to make it happen and make it even better than you imagined. Let me help you today. Write to me at scott@jewishcoffeehouse.com or go to jewishcoffeehouse.com, click on Productions, and sign up for a free consultation. Make your voice heard, promote your cause, sell your product, and engage an audience now. I'm Scott Kahn. This has been The Orthodox Conundrum on jewishcoffeehouse.com.